We are living in a nature catastrophe. For example, scientists have recently reported that there are 3 billion fewer birds flying the skies of North America than there were in the 1970s. We are told we are causing an insect apocalypse with declines in thousands of species over the last 30 years. The obvious question to me was, why is this happening? Why didn't we notice this? It is because ecological change is often insensibly slow or subtle, sometimes taking decades or even centuries to become measurable. If loss happens in such a way that we can't notice it happening, if we can't see it, feel it, or practically measure it, it will be insensible to us. When I say the word nature, you probably envision a scene something like this. Trees in a forest, beautiful wildflowers. You just know that there are birds singing off in the trees and bees buzzing around the flowers. Here's another forest. Same level of green, trees, flowers. But are they the same or are they different? What are you sensing? What are you not sensing? Sometimes looking at photographs like these is a little bit like having glasses fitted. Do you prefer this one or this one? A or B? We'll come back to these photographs later in the talk, but they illustrate something that I want to say today. That not all greens have the same value, and that you need to look closely and often in order to detect change. Physiologists have long called certain types of water loss insensible. We lose water through our skin, even when we're not sweating, and from our lungs as we breathe. And it accounts for almost 30% of our water loss each day. And if we ignore it, can lead to debilitating water loss and dehydration. Physiologists call it insensible because we cannot feel it or see it happening. The same thing is happening in nature. We are in the greatest period of global loss since the last ice age, and it's been caused by us. We have degraded or destroyed 77% of the world's landmass and 87% of the oceans. We have doubled the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, leading to unprecedented global warming. And because of this, species are now going extinct at a rate 1,000 times higher than they should be, higher than any time since the last 5 global mass extinctions, where we lost 75 to 95% of all species each and every time. And we are now living in the 6th mass extinction. Let's consider insects as an example. They exist on every continent on the planet, and they fill important and irreversible ecological roles on our planet. And yet, they are in serious decline, especially in places with intensive agriculture and industry like North America and Europe. In fact, in Germany, they have recently reported that they have lost 76% of all flying insects in that country. And insect pollinators that we depend on to fertilize the majority of plants on the planet are in serious trouble. Monarch populations are down by 90%, and some wild bees, like this rusty-patched bumblebee, are down to populations just 10% of what they were 20 years ago. If this continues, we expect to lose 40% of all insect species in just the next few decades. So why aren't we noticing this happening? Part of the reason is from what psychologists call change blindness. We simply don't notice when a stimulus is introduced or taken away, especially if they are very similar to each other. Imagine you're sitting outside on a warm summer evening and you're surrounded by 50 mosquitoes. You might run inside, but when you venture out again, you're now surrounded by only half as many mosquitoes. Would you sense that as a distinct difference? I think most of us wouldn't. In fact, we'll only notice a change in insect populations when there are hardly any or none left. We have to deal with an extreme amount of visual information that comes into our brains. And we do this by ignoring most of what's going on around us most of the time. We reduce everything into a simple forest, green and blue, trees and plants, water and sky. We don't count the trees, so if a few are missing, we won't notice. Or if they're replaced by invasive species, we won't sense that either. We don't even notice change when it's happening right in front of us. Have you ever driven down a familiar street right after a building's been torn down? You'll notice that the scene is now very different, but try to remember what that building looked like before it was torn down. That's often very difficult. Psychologists call this personal amnesia, and this amnesia extends over generations, where each succeeding generation has a degraded sense of what pristine nature should look like. Marine biologist Lauren McClanahan cleverly documented this using photographs of trophy-sized fish that were caught in the Florida Keys over the last 70 years. What she found is that fish species changed and sizes got smaller with each succeeding generation. Fish that are impressive enough to Instagram today are so small they would have been tossed aside, not worthy of a photograph in the 1950s. So all these things come together. We have faulty memories, we don't pay attention, and we have a degraded sense of what normal should be. And this leads to very dangerous situations. People crash their cars when they don't notice that a light has changed. In nature, land is degraded, populations decline, and species go extinct. And I'm talking about what we can see, but remember, there's lots going on behind that curtain of green and blue. These ecosystem services are things that we all depend on. So when species are lost, everything they do is lost, jeopardizing our life support system. An even more dangerous thing that happens with insensible loss is the idea that this degraded sense of normal is acceptable. Several environmental writers have argued recently that it's okay if there are fewer native species or if those species have been replaced by non-native invasive species, because it will still be green. They argue that it doesn't matter which species of insects or plants are there, because insects will keep doing insect-like things and plants will keep doing plant-like things. Only they don't. Entomologist Doug Tallamy studied non-native ginkgo trees that are commonly planted throughout the United States. And what he found is that on every tree, almost all the leaves were nearly perfect, just like this tree that's right outside my home. Why are the leaves so perfect? It's because there are no insects that are feeding on these leaves. They aren't adapted to feed on these leaves. And without those leaf-eating insects, there are no invertebrate predators like beetles and spiders. And without the beetles and spiders, there's no birds attracted to the trees. There's no other wildlife. Ptolemy has argued that the city might as well put in plastic trees. Which brings us back to our photographs from earlier. This is a protected forest in a natural area. It is filled with native species. It has high diversity, including this native woodland phlox. And there are a number of pollinators, there are birds, and lots of other species of wildlife as well. It's a busy, noisy, diverse place. This forest is just as green, but it's very different. Sometime in the past, the native trees were cut down, and that allowed for invasive plant species like this Dame's rocket, which on first glance looks very similar to the phlox, but has actually outcompeted and eliminated the phlox from this area. These plants don't attract species, insect species and pollinators, which doesn't provide much for other wildlife like birds and mammals. This is a not very diverse, not very healthy, depauperate and quiet place. But we don't have to accept this continual decline. There are many large ways that we can enact change through legislation, but there are also many small ways that we as individuals can act by helping scientists to collect data as citizen scientists, or by making changes to the environments that we live in. Two easy things that we can do is to use no pesticides or herbicides, or at least less pesticides and herbicides, and to replace grass with native species, to create little habitat islands that will attract native wildlife. These might seem like isolated pockets, but when there are many of these small gardens, they link together like stepping stones, creating habitat that allows species to move through a corridor from one area to another. Monarchs have already gained a little in the past few years in Canada and the United States because of the actions of individual landowners. People are planting native milkweeds that the species need to survive and creating habitat gardens like these that attract pollinators and provide habitat. We are living in a nature catastrophe, but there are ways forward. Our psychological limitations limit our ability to sense change over time. But if we are mindful and make different choices, then little by little, we can reverse insensible loss and foster insensible gain. Thank you.